Yes, welcome to another edition of Emerging Issues. This one a YouTube exclusive. It's Jason and Brenton on deck. And B, mate, we're going to be talking the minor buy round and major buy round period, which, as you and I know, is a very fun period in the season where we've got to do plenty of planning.
Yeah, it's where it takes the good coaches to the champions, mate, is the perfect buy planning, or as perfect as you can possibly make it.
Yeah, so we're going to cover a lot of aspects around it because obviously we're a long way away from round 12. So we'll cover off the period itself. We'll talk oversubscription and overstacking, what the minor buy round rule change might do for your planning, look at the types of buy schedules that each team have, go through some red dot management with some case studies, obviously talk around good buy schedule does not equal good fantasy buy, holding on to origin players, and then of course we'll end with some principles for good major buy round period strategies. So B, let's get into the major buy round period. Geez, it'd be good if I could actually say it properly. What's coming up for the coaches in 2025?
Yep, so there's a whole bunch of different types of buy rounds, as we talked about, major buy rounds and minor buy rounds. It's going from round 12 to 19 this year. Last year it was 13 to 20, which has a bit of trade implication for round 12, but we can get to that a little bit later. The types of buy rounds that you can have, there's 3 major buys, which there's 7 teams that are part of that. 3 minor buys, which have 3 teams, and 2 standalone buys is 1 team. Origin players obviously have their availability impacted, as you can see on the screen, because no matter if all the major buy rounds happen through Origin, so if they're going to Origin, they're not going to be playing, even if their team was supposed to be playing. They go into camp in round 12, 15, and 18. With the potential to back up in 13, 16, and 19, depending on the turnarounds and injuries and things like that. This is, as I said from the start, this is where good coaches turn into great coaches if you can plan this perfectly. It's a little bit easier this year, which we'll get into again, but at the end of the day, this is where you can shoot up from a rank of 10,000 to probably in the top 1,000 pretty easily.
Yeah, you certainly can. I know last year I think I was outside the top 5,000 till about round 15. Finished inside the top 2,000, which I know some people will point say that's not an amazing rank, but it's more the point. Started really poorly, made some poor trades between rounds 3 to 8, and still got a somewhat respectable rank. So that's what this period is all about, managing that. Now, as you can see on the screen here, we've got all the teams as their buys occur, which you can have a look at your leisure. But let's get into the 2 big issues here, B. So the first one is oversubscription. So essentially, it's the concept of having excess players for a position in a major and minor buy round. So, for example, in round 12, you might have 5 edges that are available. You can only play 2. You've got oversubscription of 3 unless some in the mature position. And I know in previous years, Bs, this has been a big issue in the majors, but obviously now with the minor buy round rule change, which we'll get to in a second, it's also going to be an issue in those rounds as well.
Yeah, I think it's actually the oversubscription is probably more of an issue now because of those minor buy rounds not needing 17 players, only needing the 13. Examples in those minors, especially very popular buys like not Toby Couchman so much because he's dual position, but Dylan Egan and Jacob Preston. If you were to go out and buy a Kai Pearce-Paul, all of a sudden you've got 3 edges. You can only play 2 of them. So I think that needs to come into calculations when you have a look at the guns that you're bringing in. For a position of need in those particular minor buy rounds.
Yeah, that's a perfect example there because I know on the fantasy game plan we've been talking about Jacob Preston being an awesome option. Dylan Egan's come from nowhere, and then obviously I just can't stop talking about Toby Couchman. So there's going to be a lot of coaches out there that might have all 3 of them. Of course, Kai Pearce-Paul, one of my guys as well. Let's roll to overstacking. So similar concept, except instead of looking at positions, we're looking at teams. So there is 2 standalone buys this year in 14 and 17. And if you overstack, it's having, say, 3, 4, even 5 from that particular team, meaning you've got to make a lot of trades that round or you risk not having 17 good scorers or even just actually having a scoring 17 at all. And I think, last year, I know for me, this forced me in round 15. I had a couple too many Bulldogs. It forced me to make too many trades. You might have been similar. And at least this year, it's only the Roosters that have this overstacking risk when it comes to the major buy round period.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up round 15 last year. That's where I think I dropped about 7,000 ranks in 1 week because of that one round. But look, exactly right. And look, this is the reason why we have that golden rule of probably 3 players max per team, regardless of buy rounds. Because at the end of the day, you start fielding like your point players who are scoring 20s, or you might have a laid out or whatever. So Roosters are probably the perfect example for this particular exercise because of such fantasy relevance. You've got James Tedesco, you've got Marky Mark, you've got Rob Toyer, you've got Hugo Savala that's come in, people still holding Sandon Smith, Nafafu White, Sia Wong, Victor Radley's cheap now, Connor Watson. Like there's so much relevance there. But if you've got too many of them, then you're not fielding a full 17.
Yeah, and that's the real risk, that we've got this team that's going to be really awesome. We'll touch on their buy schedule structure in a second, but yeah, just a team that you need to be careful of when it comes to that overstacking risk. But we sort of alluded to it already. Major buy round periods are now mirroring the minor buys in the sense you only need a starting 13. I think there's a lot of things that we will explore further into this video, but I think the big thing is that now it means that those teams that miss maybe one or two minor buys but have good availability in the majors, the players from those teams just become that ever slightly bit more valuable over this period.
Yeah, exactly right. And look, this probably does make it easier, as we said, is because, in the previous minor buy rounds, you had to field a whole 17. So when it came time for that minor buy round, you were max trading every week just to get a 17. And it was a little bit harder to plan. Whereas with this one, it's you're only fielding for certain positions, and it doesn't really matter if you've got that many extras. So, so it does add to the 2024 scenario. But it's going to alleviate some of those state of origin stars, as it says, for backup.
Yes, and I think it's also nicely balanced as well. You mentioned before that we don't get 4 trades access until round 13, which is of course the first minor. But the other thing is with this major buy-in period moving forward around, we don't get access to the final 8 trades until round 20, which is after that final minor. So I think at least it should balance this period out quite nicely. And for the hope of NRL Fantasy, because they want the engagement, they want clicks on the website, and that most coaches, every coach is going to exit this major buy-in period with at least 8 trades, and maybe this change might mean they might have something like 12 or 13 to use in those final 8 rounds.
Yeah, I think so. I do think that engagement piece is very, very important to bring up, because at the end of the day, people like to trade. While they're there, they think it's never going to run out. And then all of a sudden you get to the back end and it's like, oh, crap, I've got no trades. And then that engagement drops off in that last 3 rounds before you get those extra 8 trades. And by then, the people who wasted all their trades are using all their trades to fix their side up once they get the 8 trades back. So then they're only running with 3 or 4 to get in the last 8 rounds. And, there's injuries, there's restings, there's so much. And, I think this is a smart move by both fantasy and the NRL to make the game a bit more engaging, a little bit easier as well, to make sure that everyone is still logging in every week and doing what they have to do.
Yes, and I think for some coaches at this point, there might be a little bit of a false sense of security that's going to be super easy. But I think at this point, just thinking about up until probably the last round where we started to really ramp up the injuries, I know my side hasn't been smashed by injuries. Obviously, everyone copped Jamie Humphries, but I don't think most coaches would have had anything more than maybe 3 or 4 major injuries and maybe a suspension or 2 to this point compared to last season.
Yeah, well, there's that, and there's also the fact that all the cash cows are pretty well hit this year. So last year was just a nightmare for cash cows, and we just had to continually recycle the cash cows that had failed just to try and bring in the next hopeful. So we haven't had to probably waste as many trades. I've got a couple in the bank from that I haven't used, and my side's actually looking like it's pretty well close to near where I want it to be already in round 7. So. That's definitely not the case last year.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how it plays out once we actually hit this period and how many injuries and suspensions we get. But let's start off with our coverage here with the types of buy schedules. So we mentioned already, there's 6 major and minors, so they fall on 12, 13, 15, 16, and 18, 19, so 3 of each. In 2025, the clubs will have one of the following buy schedules. They'll either play all 6 of those, they'll play 5, or they'll be in one of 3 categories that plays 4. So they'll either play 3 majors, miss a minor, play 2 majors, play 2 minors, or they play just the 1 major and play all 3 minors. So let's roll into these teams. We'll start with the Chooks. We've already spoken about them before. They missed 17 and 14 during this period, with round 10 before the period. A super fantasy relevant team, as you alluded to before. They've got some dual position players, but they've also got a couple of guys that are either close to certainties for Origin, like Angus Crichton, and then those that are on the precipice, like James Tedesco.
So exactly right, and this is where the oversubscription of players in a team is probably more relevant than their buy schedule. So, with how much fantasy relevance that they all have, I still think the 3 is probably the max you want to carry, just because round 15 last year we alluded to that was a horrible round. That was a standalone buy for just the Bulldogs, no one else. and it was the hardest round of the entire year. So don't sleep on the fact that it's just the Roosters having to bye. It can come back and bite you.
Yeah, it certainly can, because I know it did for me and it did for you, and many coaches as well lured into a false sense of security with having plenty of Bulldogs. We'll go to the next two teams. They play 5, so they both just miss one major, and that's the Cowboys. So they miss round 12, which will be their second bye, and then the Knights, they only miss round 18 this period, which will also be their second bye. Now, obviously, Cowboys probably not super fantasy relevant, but we can't ignore the fact that after round 12, their next bye is the final round of the season.
Yeah, I think a lot of Cowboys players will be on the radar. Again, there's not too much fantasy relevance outside potentially Scott Drinkwater, but it's a good runway if you've planned well for round 12, and then all of a sudden you need to get rid of someone like let's say a like a Jermaine Hopgood or someone like that who's got a round 15 and round 18 bye. You can pivot into someone from the Cowboys who you know is not going to miss a game through the rest of that time.
Yeah, and I think Scott Drinkwater will be very, very highly owned in the active parts of NRL Fantasy just because, again, he'll play in all those rounds. Goal kicking winger fullback. Very, 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 very tiny risk of getting picked for New South Wales at fullback because we've got probably 8 fullbacks that might be better than him. But the Knights, mate, this team is also quite huge in this period. Obviously, Kalen Pong is usually the headliner, but we expect him to probably play at least game 1 for Queensland. But outside of that, they've got a few guys, like the Fletcher Sharps that are, obviously not on the radar for New South Wales yet. But they've also got international players like Kai Pearce-Paul and Leo Thompson are some examples that are getting thrown around into teams. I know they're both currently sitting in my team. That, from this point onwards, as long as they don't get suspended or injured, they can give you high quality points from now until round 18.
Well, exactly right. And then you can actually swing those players in round 18 to suit different buy planning to potentially guys who have already completed all of their buys, like let's say like a Beau Fermor or a Jerome Hughes or someone like that, depending on the positions, obviously, and how your squad's balanced. But so I really like the Knights players. Again, just being very careful that you're not oversubscribing into a position with players that you already have, i.e. the Preston, Egan, Kai Pearce-Paul conversation.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and that's probably where like someone like Fletcher Sharp has more versatility because he's a winger fullback / half. So if you've got Nathan Cleary and James Tedesco in your team, and you're sweating bullets on both of them getting picked, which you think Cleary will and Tedesco maybe not, at least you've got that guy there in round 12 that can flick around as well with your winger fullback centre guys, which is a great segue into the next category of teams. So we're going into teams that play 4 of the majors and minors. So we're going to start with the Bulldogs and the Sea Eagles. So they play all 3 majors, like the Roosters do, but they do miss a minus. They play all 3 majors and they only play 1 minus. So the Bulldogs, they miss 13-16, which are their last 2 buys for the season. Once we get past round 9, Manly will miss 16 and 19. But these are going to be really, really key teams because they play all 3 majors. Yeah, they do miss 2 minors, but as we spoke about before, you only need a starting 13. So if you had, say, maybe 1 or 2 from these teams, I think it might work really well for your team composition across this period.
I think it will. Again, I don't want to be the naysayer on it, but you've also got to be careful of the positional oversubscription that might be, you might be running a Ruben Garrick with a Jacob Carraz, and you might be bringing in Tom Trbojevic as well. All of a sudden it's going to make round 16 really, really, really tricky.
Yeah, and that's a great point, that these teams are going to be awesome to help unlock some good green dots for those major buy rounds. But again, you can't go too heavily into them because it's like anything. I think if you eat too many vegetables, you end up getting sick eventually. And these 2 teams certainly fit into that category. Roll to the next category of teams that just play 4 of the major and minors. So these ones play 2 majors and 2 minors. So we've got the Dolphins and Sharks that miss 13 and 18. We've got the Dragons who miss 12 and 16. And after that, they'll be done with their buys. The Bunnies miss 12 and 19, and then the Raiders miss 15 and 19. So some interesting teams here, B, and I think having a collection of players from these teams, again, varying up when you've got guys on red dots, these 5 teams are going to be very, very handy.
Yeah, I think they're super handy as well. In the long term as well. So, I know a lot of coaches will be like, oh, I need to get players for round 12, so they won't look at the Dragons guys or the Bunnies guys. Whereas they're actually the super helpful ones for round 18, which is also going to be a bit trickier. So don't sleep on it. But at the end of the day, don't just think of round 12. You've got to think of the entire buy period as a whole.
Yeah, especially with the Dragons because they've already had a bye in round 3. So once they get to 16, which, yeah, look, we've just mentioned might be a little bit tricky. Once that's done, it's open slather for them. And you'd imagine with the way they're going this year, with a couple of wins, couple of defeats, they should hopefully be competing for that top 8, which should mean that all their fantasy relevant players, their good players, should be still getting decent roles until round 27.
Yeah, that's exactly what you'd think. But at the end of the day, I think with Canberra, we've got all the players that we want, and people again oversubscribing to a team. Like people might be running Starling, Horsburgh, Nicholson, Tamale, Fogarty. It's probably end up going to be, yeah, okay, I've got them for round 12 and 18, but you're probably going to move some of them on a little bit earlier to guys who are missing round 12, but then have got the straight run through.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing to note as well is that 4 of these 5 teams on this have a bye at the end of the season. So you just need to keep that in mind as well. The Dragons are the only ones that do not. Move to the next one, and these are the teams where if you've got Origin players, probably the easiest to hold because they only play one major, so it only adds one red dot for that player's season, but they play all 3 minors. So we've got the Broncos, Storm, and Tigers missing 12 and 15. We've got the Titans missing 12 and 18, so they play all 5 in the middle of that. And then the Eels, Panthers, and Wars play the first major bye in around 12, but miss 15 and 18. So these teams, you look at it on paper, probably not the most amazing because they only play one major, but if you've got a couple of, say, Origin guys that don't back up or anything like that, these teams might come to the fore depending on what sort of coverage you need during the period.
Well, exactly right. And this stems well for even potential guys who might make their Origin debut, like a Terrell May and obviously Payne Haas will be there. There's Dave Fafita, Tino, Harry Grant, Nathan Cleary, Isaiah Yeo. Like there's just like 7 names that we can rattle straight off that are gun at fantasy or have been previous guns in fantasy, where owning them and holding them through those bye periods is not going to be that detrimental to your side as long as you've got cover.
Yeah, and that's right. Yeah, we can have a few of these guys in. And the other thing to keep in mind as well, B, is that because the Roosters miss 14 and 17, having some guys from these teams in the positions of the players that you might be missing, say it might be James Tedesco or Connor Watson somehow misses Origin, having guys from these teams being available in those rounds will help negate the fact that 14-17 you'll be without your chooks.
So 100%, and 14 might be the round that you choose to move off some of those chooks as well. Example could be if Hugo Savala is topped out, you could almost do a straight swap for a Jerome Hughes by round 16. So then all of a sudden you've got Jerome Hughes for the rest of the year. So one's to consider on, I guess, not just buy planning, but when the opportune time is to bring some of these guys in.
Yeah, and the Titans as well, they play those 5 in the middle, which can be quite handy. I know the Storm have had that the last 2 years where they missed the first and the third major, but then they play 5 in a row, which certainly helps with Origin backups. In terms of buy structures, these are the teams that have a buy after the major buy-in period. So Broncos in round 20, then the Finns, the Wars, the Tigers, the Raiders, the Sharks, the Bunnies in round 26 again, like in 2023, and then the Cowboys wrap us up. So just keep it in mind for those teams, but probably not end of the world unless you've got heaps from those teams. But let's get into the rule change. I know we sort of spoke about it before, but I think it kind of changes our advice a bit. I know for me, last year and the year before, I was telling people, look, be careful how many Origin players you have and how many red dots you have in minor buy rounds because you have to play a 17. Now that you have to play a 13, there might be a bit of a lean this year to sort of reversing that strategy a little bit in maybe holding maybe an extra 1 or 2 Origin players and then maybe strategically having a couple of guys that miss a minor buy round or 2.
Yeah, well, it's going to work out perfectly pretty much for the guys who are gun in fantasy as well as Origin stars. So Nathan Cleary, Isaiah Yeo, Payne Haas, Terrell May are the first 4 that come to my mind who are 65 plus easily on their day. And they don't have the greatest buy scheduling, but they're going to be now keepers for you, so you don't have to get rid of them and then work out a way to get back a 900 grand player at some stage later on in the season.
Yeah, and with that, it saves trades, right? If you don't have to trade Nathan Cleary out, you don't have to trade him back in. I mean, he might get hurt in the period like he has in previous years, but if he gets rested and managed at the right times and doesn't get hurt, you're saving trades there, which then should ideally make this period a little bit easier. But the key thing, mate, is the red dot management is what's going to really help coaches throughout this period. And what we mean by that is obviously you don't want to have extreme oversubscription in terms of having too many players in one position the edge example we gave before. You don't want 4 good edge players when you can only play 2 of them. It also means that your red dots are throughout the period, and as well, it helps you save trades. We've got the 3 aspects here of managing your red dots in the majors, in the minors, and the standalones. And I think the key thing is, if you can get this right, not only do you not have the oversubscription, overstacking issues, but the ability to save trades in a year where everyone's going to have probably a 14 million team full of guns, it's going to be key to have trades at the end to be able to chase coaches down.
100%, mate. And at the end of the day, that's the whole conserving trades thing that we kind of brought up before, where it's probably going to be a little bit easier this year to conserve those because you're not having to do those constant sideways movements just to field a full team. So I think if you manage it well, I think this year, if anything, it's going to be harder to make up ranks unless you have a very good buy plan.
Yes, and a little bit of luck needs to go your way, as it does in every single year of fantasy. But let's start looking at our major buy and red dot management. Now, we sort of alluded to this in the last edition of Emerging Issues and we're speaking about round 12. And obviously, if you only need a starting 13, it gives you a maximum 8 red dots. Now, your red dots can come from origin players as well as players on the buy. But in a way, if you've got a team that only misses the majors in terms of their biases, so for example, Penrith or Parramatta, it doesn't actually matter how many Parramatta or Penrith players you have, as long as them combined with your origin players don't send you over 8 red dots in these rounds.
Yeah, exactly right. I think it just comes back. We're going to be going full circle of don't oversubscribe to a team, but it's not the end of the world if you have 4 that you really, really like, especially in those rounds because you only need to field the 13 instead of the 17.
Yeah. But the key thing is, though, is this: we don't want to, inverted commas, waste these red dots. Like, we want to prioritize them because obviously we've got an elite gun regardless of whether they play origin or not. Round 12, like your Toby Couchmans, your Nathan Clearys, your Payne Haas's, Trail Mates. If we're going to hold on to them, we're happy to have them as red dots in those rounds. And anyone that's underpriced. So, for example, if there's a cheapie that pops up in the next week or two that looks like they're going to make 200, 300K, we're probably going to hold on to them. But I think what we want to do is avoid anyone outside of those because they become surplus to requirements. Now, an example of this, right, might be, we just spoke about the Knights. They play 5 of the 6 major and minor buy rounds, and Hooker looks pretty hard, right, for round 12 because no Mamazelis. A coach might go, oh, I think Phoenix Crossland is a great price at the moment, or in 2 weeks will be because he's got a low score on him. I'll go pick him up. But the issue is, B, you get to round 12, you look at Phoenix Crossland, he's averaging, say, 35 at best. You're going to look at every other team you're competing against in round 12 and go, oh, everyone's running an Aaron Clark, a Max Plath, a Marshall King, a Wade Egan, one of those kinds of players, even a Reed Marnie, and go, I actually need to spend a trade and buy another player. And as a result, yeah, Crossland might be a green dot for you in that round, but is essentially a red dot because you're not going to play him because his score won't be good enough.
Yeah, I think that's coming into it now because we've all had those successful cashies. It's almost going to be a strategy of cows and guns, and it's not really worth it to be going those mid ranges at this point of the season.
Yeah, and Jazz Tavunga was one that we sort of hoped would be that guy, but again, Lachlan Croker has basically kiboshed that by not being available and sending Jazz back to the middle rotation. So you need to be really careful that, just because a cheapie plays round 12, if they're not going to be a competitive score in that round, they're as good as a red dot. So just be very, very careful when looking at where your red dots come from. But let's roll to the minor buy round because I think this will be the key change this year where we can be a little bit more aggressive with how many red dots we have in these rounds. So again, same thing. You can have a maximum of 8 red dots now. But I don't know if you've done any buy planning, had a look at the footy stats one or anything like that. Most rounds, looking at 13, 16, and 19, I think for all of them, I have at least 18 players at the moment. So I don't think it's going to be an issue of having 13 players for your starting 13 in these rounds. It's just going to be a matter of how many of those 13 are going to be really good quality.
It's not about how many players as well you've got available. It's got to be in those positions as well. I need to really stress the importance on that because I have done buy planning. I have essentially started a couple of weeks ago to make sure that I was bringing in the right players who I thought were going to be keepers. And my example would be wing fullback from round 15 onwards. Gets pretty tricky to start filling in with decent players. So, again, oversubscription, you might have, 3 edges, 5 mids, 3 hookers, and 4 halves, but only running 2 centers and 1 wing fullback. They're not the greatest of scorers, but they are going to be super important for your minor buy rounds.
Yeah, they certainly are. And the reason that we say it's probably going to be easier to fill these out, because, again, go look at footy stats on their buy planner. And you'll see for those rounds, most coaches are going to have a minimum of 18 available for those rounds. Obviously the Origin guys are assumed to be backing up. But the fact is in the minors, because there's only 3 teams off, we've got 14 teams to get starting 13 from. So it should be pretty easy to find decent players in every position that we need. And this is where if we pick the right players or the right types of players in terms of the buy schedules, we can maybe pick up 1 or 2 that miss maybe 1 or 2 of these. And we've got some case studies that we're going to roll into where we potentially see some efficiency. Now, the first guy, Max King, obviously high attention this week because, after I had written this, he goes out and gets a big 86 with a try. But the reason why Max King was on our radar B is consistent mid-scorer that will average 50 plus, and he's not gone below 50 this year. He's already got 1 minor buy out of the way, so he's just got the 2 left in 13 and 16. But all going well with our Origin guys, if they back up, say you hold 2 of them, you're only going to need to find another green dot mid in those rounds, which, with some of us looking at potentially an Aaron Clark with Peter Mamazellus, it might actually be too hard in some of those rounds. So this is a guy that, if you're looking to hold, say, 2 Origin guys in the mids, could be a really good way of complementing the fact that the Origin guys miss the majors, but they might be available to play in the minors.
Yeah, I think this is a perfect case study to have a look at, mainly for the position that he plays versus how many fantasy relevant players who will play Origin play in that position, which is essentially Yo, Haas, and May. You're going to presume that they all will go to Origin, even Terrell May. And then the likes of Corey Horsburgh might get picked, Jermaine Hopgood. Like those are more mids that you're having to start filling in. So it's, again, a case of timing. I don't think Matt King's price is going to get away from you, and he could be one that you bring in that major buy once you find out who is actually selected for that side.
Yeah, and that's right. Now, we know his price is obviously going to rise a bit over the next couple of weeks, but what goes up must come down. When that 86 comes out, he might drop down to a more acceptable price close to that period. So he's just an example of a player in a position that we know is quite tough, where we actually need 3 of them in all 3 of the major buy rounds. So we're not saying he's a must-have over the period, but he would be very useful, again, if you're looking to hold on to some Origin mids and you expect them to back up, either in 13 and or 16. Next guy we'll go to that's also in this segment is Ruben Garrick. So we know with him what he is: dual position, outside back, goal kicker, good attacking player, pretty decent floor. I don't think he scored below 30 this year. Once he gets round 9 buy out of the way, much like Max King, it's just 16 and 19. So we do think that there should be a plethora of winger fullbacks that might be available in this period of time to play, because their teams do play. So, Ponga and Sharp at the Knights will be available. Jaden Campbell, if he comes back from injury and stays fit. James Tedesco, Scott Drinkwater. So you would think as well, with some of the other centres as well, shouldn't be too hard to cover his absence, provided you don't get too many other Manly and Bulldogs players in your team.
So exactly right. And that dual position is going to be so helpful for if you need to shore up that third wing fullback spot in round 12, or maybe you're wanting to move off Robert Toyer, but you need to make sure you have a centre for round 15. So that's where Gary's going to be fantastic. I think both these teams, their buy planning is basically like a cheat code, how you've said it before. It's so easy to own them.
Yes. Now, obviously, we don't want to have too many of them, but again, these are 2 examples of plays that are fantasy relevant plays in the sense that they've got prospects of averaging 50 plus for the entire season, but their buy schedule probably makes it a bit easier for you to manage this period. So most coaches would probably have Garrick in the active spaces. I know a lot of them jumped on after he got those 4 tries against the Raiders, but there'll still be time to pick him up after his first buy in round 9. Let's move to the standalone buy Red Dot Management B, because obviously this is important as well. It's probably a little bit easier this year, because instead of it being the Bulldogs and Finns like last year, it's just one team in the Roosters that we need to have a look at. So the reason that it can get tricky, and it did for us last year, mate, is of course we've got the Roosters unavailable in these rounds, but we can still have players that get suspended. We could get a guy that gets injured, either long-term or just a Cat 1 HIA in round 13 or 16, and as a result misses these rounds. And you just want to be careful, right? Because as you said, if you have, say, 3 of them and maybe a couple of guys get short-term injuries or someone gets dropped or 1 week suspension, you're basically forced into making trades.
Yeah, 100%. And look, at the end of the day, this is why we say don't subscribe to a team. If you're carrying 4 Roosters, all I would be saying is that maybe have a contingency on, if you wanted to keep 3 of them, who is the one that you'd be happy to let go through to the scrap heap? And have that in your mind, so that way you know which player you're happy with to transition off, so that way you can trade them out to field that 17 that you need.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because if you get no injuries, no suspensions or anything like that, and everyone's available, then yeah, you might be able to deal with three Roosters being off, because your team value will be massive at that point, so you should have a pretty gun 18 players available to you. Case study for the standalone buys is Nafahu White, so good option here, dual position asset. With a DPP that is actually quite interesting, because it's middle and edge. We've spoken around middle being quite hard, but then also in some rounds, edge might be difficult to feel, like in round 16. Kiwi international, so he's not going to play for New South Wales or Queensland. And then obviously he's got 6 major or minors, where there's actually a chance that, obviously in the majors, his origin teammates won't be there, but maybe some of them don't back up in the minors.
Yeah, that's it. And look, that spells great news for him, because obviously there's more minutes, just for him in particular. Again, that dual position, that's going to be so handy. I don't think people realize, even though mid edge is obviously one of the most common dual positions that you can get, it's going to be so handy through this buy period. Hence why I've held on to Hopgood, even through Jason Riles' expert coaching of playing him at hooker, or deciding to play him for 38 minutes. But I digress, and not salty at all on that.
Not at all. I need to get you a tequila shot and a bit of lemon. But just looking at Nafahu White just in more detail, obviously we've mentioned before, Yome and Haas, we expect them to play Origin, but even if they don't, all three of them play, May and Haas have a bye in round 12 anyway, so you're going to need some mids in there. And Nafahu White's obviously scored quite well this year. He's got a good motor on him. He's probably going to average close to 50 rest of the year, so a good hold. Whether you go out and buy him, that's dealer's choice on that one. I'd probably steer clear. But the other aspect as well that we probably haven't touched on so far yet, mate, is that in those rounds when they're unavailable, actually having a guy that you can loop with might be massive, right? Because we do think that a lot of coaches will have pretty gun, mid, and edge contingents at that point, especially if they hold on to the origin gun. So having a bloke like White that you can basically combo loop with any two plays in those rounds might be gold dust, because you might have a cheapie that goes absolutely massive in the edge position, and with Nafahu White in your team, you can loop them in.
Yeah, 100%. Like all options are on the table, which is what makes the game so much fun, and with that looping capability. So again, looping's not cheating; it's part of the game. If you're not cheating, you're not trying. So I heard that somewhere. I can't even remember where I heard that one from. But so yeah, look, that's where it's also not going to be a bad thing. But I'd rather be prepared, and then again, only having 3 from the one team to then have a potential scoring 18, so you actually do have the chance to loop.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really, really good point there. Now, Pete, we've obviously spoken around teams that have good buy schedules, good complementary buy schedules, but I think the thing that we do need to touch on when we're talking around buy planning is the fact that just because a team has a good buy schedule doesn't mean every single player in that particular team will be a good buy for the major buy round period.
Well, exactly right. At the end of the day, it's the basic principle of fantasy, isn't it? You bring in the players who are going to score your points. If I'd rather have a guy who's going to average 50 and miss 2 buy rounds than a guy who's going to average 30 but plays all of them. At the end of the day, the averages are what's going to tell the tale. And there's no point in bringing in guys that you're actually not happy of keeping.
Yeah, or playing either, because if you bring in, like, again, I use Crossland as an example just because he plays, 12, 13, 15, 16. Yeah, he plays those rounds, but if you don't want his score in those rounds, he's as good as a red dot. So I think it's very important when you're looking at players that might have good availability, particularly our Manly players, our Canterbury Bankstown players, our Cowboys, our Knights that have a lot of availability in this period. Don't just buy them in because they play all those rounds. Different story if you're looking at a cash down towards the end, where you might not be worried about playing them in, say, 18 or 19, but we probably don't want to be hitting a cash down in for round 12, right? Unless it's someone that we think might potentially get a bit of a runway to make some cash. Now, Brad Schneider could be an example, because if you look at the Panthers' schedule, they play around 12, so clearly won't be available. You assume Schneider comes in at 7. By that point, it'll be 250k if he keeps coming off the bench. Maybe Cleary doesn't back up because of the hamstring issues. And then you think about, they don't play 15, but round 16, game 2 of Origins in Perth, and they have an away game in New Zealand. So there's also a chance there that Brad Schneider gets a game. And it's kind of looking at those players, weighing up the risk profile for them and identifying if those cash downs work. But usually they're a little bit better at the end of the season, right?
Yeah, exactly right. And I think it's a good shout on the Brad Schneider thing, and making sure you also potentially don't. I mean, it's not the be all that end all, but looking at those schedules as well, taking into account what's the turnaround, what's the travel for these guys, how many minutes they actually played in Origin itself. But at the end of the day, like a Brad Schneider one, yeah, it's going to give you 2 good scores. but it's not someone I'd be happy to only have the 2 scores for just for a buy round period. Also, that knowing that his price rises will be stunted in the in between games.
Yes, and that's the really good point because, yep, guy might come in and backfill for 2 games, like maybe a Roosters player, like a Egan Butcher, for example. He's just come back from an ACL. There, you're like, yeah, he might backfill when we've got the Crichtons and the Collins of the world out. But then if he goes back to a bench role playing 15 minutes and only scoring 10, he's not going to make cash, and you're kind of stuck with him. So just be very careful of those mid ranges. All those cash down options really early in the early in this period, because they are going to stunt your team growth. But we just spoke about Origin plays, and particularly the Panthers holding on to them. So I think this year we can probably get away with 3 or 4. I think anything more than that is probably pushing the boat out a bit too far.
Yeah, look, I'd probably say 4 would be the max of Origin plays that you want to hold. And before that, I would have said probably 2 if it was last year. So I think, given that flexibility of the minor buys, I think it's really, really helped us to hang on to these guys because, as I said from the top, there's four main guys who are just constant 60-plus weapons, and they're all most likely going to play Origin.
Yeah, you'd think so. Like Terrell May is probably the one with the largest amount of doubt, and even with that, he misses 12 and 15 anyway. So it doesn't really impact his availability for NRL Fantasy that much. As you can see on the screen there's 7 teams that missed 2 majors. So your Broncos, Storm, Tigers, Titans, Eels, Panthers, Warriors. So if you've got a guy from them, it makes it even easier to hold them. Obviously, the Panthers slightly interesting, we spoke about in the last edition of Emerging Issues, where they don't play round 11, so it would mean they miss 11 and 12. And as we just spoke about 3 minutes ago, they got an away game in New Zealand after an Origin game in Perth. So potentially, maybe the Panthers guys might be more of a sell than, say, maybe a May or a Haas.
Yeah, I'd say so. There's also, and I don't think either of them are really sells unless it's something that you need to. And then again, maybe writing down a list of saying who is the player out of all these guys who I'd be happy to see go to the scrap heap for the time being. And out of those 4 guys right now, it's Yo, because Yo's got a 65 average for fun. But we've just seen last week about what these other guys can do. And especially as a captaincy option, I don't think you're getting rid of any of them.
Yeah, that's right. And we've got the luxury this year where it's really fun because we've got these captaincy options that change every single week with who might have the best matchup. And like you mentioned there with you alluded to with May and Haas there, mate, they might play less minutes in these games, but because of the way they play footy in terms of getting the offloads and more tackle busts and playmaking like they're probably more likely to score closer to their average in a 50, 55-minute role than Isaiah Yo would be in a similar period of time.
Well, exactly right. Like Isaiah Yo's averaging 65 in 80 minutes, and these guys are averaging 70 in 65 minutes. So, you'd think if Isaiah Yo's backing up, and if Panthers are doing well, he probably doesn't play as many minutes, and you might get a score in the 40s. Whereas I don't think with these other guys, you're going to get scores in the 40s.
No, I don't think he will either. So, key to holding these players, of course, get your team value up nice and high. I think most coaches will be pretty close to 13 mil next week, if not already, and then 13.5 should be a formality from there. We think with the likes of Egan, and that's still got plenty of cash in them. Even Nathan Cleary is probably making 100k in value in the next couple of weeks. Get your dual position assets in. Find a couple of assets that miss 1 or 2 of the minor buys. So obviously your Bulldogs and Seagulls are the flagship ones, but even the Dragons, Raiders, Sharks, Dolphins, and Rabbitohs could also play in there as well. And then try and find those cash outs as and where they pop in. But let's wrap it up with some principles around some strategy. Now, I think the key thing is that we need to stress, and I know we've stressed it last week on the fantasy game plan, is you've got to look at your current team and how it's composed and work out what players and what positions playing for what teams will complement what you've already got.
Yeah, and look, this is where a good spreadsheet is going to really help you have a visual as well on exactly whereabouts you're needing to plan to help you work out what the next position of need is. So I think the perfect example is round 12 this year. Is at the moment, if everyone looks at their squad, there's a lot of mids in there, but how many mids are missing either through Origin or round 12? And then all of a sudden you're going to realize, oh crap, I actually need more mids just to fill up round 12 for the time being. So having a bit of a plan there and not just relying at looking at your team and saying, oh, I've got heaps of mids, so I'm not even going to worry about that position. Get yourself a little spreadsheet, try and work out exactly what positions that you are needing and which Origin guys you're happy to hold.
Yes, and that's a really good point, mate. Like you said, we've got plenty of mids, so yeah, you might be up a creek for round 12, but your current team, as it's set up, you might have too many for 15. So having a look at that as well, and don't explode on issues that you might already have. Because I know a good one that we're looking at for, say, round 13 is, like, you're a Tom Starling owner. I think Starling's a pretty decent hold at the moment. The hooker position's not absolutely crazy, but you probably don't want to go and buy a player that plays in round 12 and 13 like a Tom Starling that doesn't have dual position, because if you're holding Mamazelis, you can only play one of those guys in round 13 and you've got yourself a oversubscription issue.
Yeah, 100%. And you've also got an oversubscription in round 19 as well in the major buy round. So again, these are all the things that you have to weigh up. And again, this is where a simple spreadsheet of just put your team name, the buy round, and then put a little red mark on if they're playing that round. It gives you the perfect visual of exactly who can potentially go to field the proper sides.
Yes, absolutely. Now you can head to Footy Stats; they've got theirs up already. We'll probably try and get one out in the next week or two, just a nice simple one that you can use in Excel. Now, next point here, the opportunities to find players that miss one or two of the minors. Now we just mentioned the teams there: Bulldogs and Seagulls. They missed two of them. We've then got the Dragons, Sharks, Rabbitohs, Dolphins, and Raiders that miss one of them. So if we can filter a couple of those in our team, if we haven't already got a few of those, that's going to help, because they'll play more majors than minors, and as a result, we should get some good scores in those major rounds.
Yeah, exactly right. Couldn't have said it better.
We just spoke about it just before. Make sure you get quality over quantity. Yeah, look, we might need a couple of cheap players to help in certain rounds, but we don't want 4 or 5 of them making up our 13, because that's where you are going to lose a lot of ranks.
Yeah, exactly right. This is, again, this is a hard one for me as well, because sometimes if you've got a guy who's got good buy coverage and is going to get you that 20 points in each of those minor buy rounds, my example is Nick Cottridge from 2 years ago. I took his scores to the bank for when he did get them in the major buys, sorry, and then I was happy to punt him as soon as I could. But those do help, but again, you want to look for people who have quality, who have a bit of a runway to make cash if they're not the greatest scorers, so that way you can transition them into either the next cash cow or recycle into a mid-range or go up to a gun.
Absolutely nailed it. And then another point as well is, obviously we're speaking about some players in this with some of the case studies that look like complementary players to most team compositions, but we've just seen a round where we had heaps of injuries and potential suspensions. So you're not trying to buy every single round 12 green dot in this week. You need to take a bit of time with it, because as we've seen this week, chaos is going to occur.
Well, exactly right, and I think a lot of coaches who, because again, I think a lot of the teams are similar this year. So there's going to be a lot of coaches who already have those red dots for round 12 that they're planning on holding anyway. So like your Mamazulis, your May, your Haas, everyone's brought in Couchman and Egan, Lockie Hubner. Nathan Cleary obviously will be on the buy for Origin. So I think, once you start looking at it again, have a little spreadsheet. Like literally, that's just what I read off just then. Is on mine, so I know who's going to be missing and then what position of need I'm going to have that I also want to get either at a discount. And Max Plath, your image on there is absolutely perfect, because he is one of my sites to work out who's going to help you in the position that you need.
Yeah, and Plath's a great example, right? Because he's just had a really bad score, so he's dropped 40k. Now he's got a super high break even that even if he bangs out 350s the next few weeks, he's going to be probably no more than 610k. So again, take your time with this, don't rush it, and see what happens. And lastly, I guess the 2 points that we've got here, Boo. Obviously, we want to be flexible when we're planning. We don't just want to go, righto, this is what our plan is at round 10 and just execute it for the next 10 rounds. But more importantly, we want to have fun with this, right? We all play NRL Fantasy for fun. Like, okay, it's not participation trophy type stuff, but there's no point getting too stressed over this, because whatever happens in fantasy is going to happen, right?
Yeah, that's it. It's not like they're going to put it on your tombstone. Well, they may if you came first. Who knows? But at the end of the day, and that's why we do it. And then it's about to engage all the punters as well, and just have a bit of fun through those group chats and things like that. And then you can rib your mates if you beat them in the head-to-heads or whatever. Like that's the whole point of it. It's not about, oh, my team outscored yours by 4 points in overall. Well done. It's about getting that banter in a very positive way.
Yeah, that's right. And making it positive, having a bit of fun. And we love that. So get involved in the socials, of course, on Facebook and Instagram, our main ones. And of course, if you are watching this video, you're obviously hopefully subscribed to Talking League Shorts on YouTube. But if not, get in there, chuck a comment in there. We'll get back to them as quickly as we can. Like and share with people that might need a bit of guidance with their major buy and period planning. But that'll wrap us up for this edition of Emerging Issues. Thank you for joining us, and be sure to catch us in the next one. Bye for now.